Hey everyone, Jerry here. Before we pick up where we left off, a quick reminder this series is about knowledge, not use. Nothing you'll hear promotes consumption or sale. It's about understanding what history, science, and culture actually recorded. Every law, every discovery, every shift we trace comes from documented evidence and peer reviewed research, not speculation. When we closed the last chapter, the story of cannabis had already stretched from the soil of Tibet to the ports of Rome, a living thread of chemistry that carried knowledge farther than empire ever could. Now, as we step into the second arc, the world is changing. Faith is hardening, trade is globalizing, and the written word is about to do what myth once did, decide what survives and what is forgotten. This is the age where the healer becomes the alchemist, where medicine becomes doctrine, and where a plant that once symbolized endurance will begin to test the limits of control itself. We're moving from fire pits and braziers into libraries and laboratories, from ritual to process. You're about to hear how the practical art of extraction evolved into the first language of chemistry, how ideas moved through translation and conquest, and how belief reshaped biology into law. Everything that follows is part of that continuum. Every empire that touched this plant left fingerprints in texts, in trade records, in medical codices. And as we trace those fingerprints, you'll see that knowledge, once meant to heal, was slowly divided between those allowed to remember and those forced to forget. So, welcome back. The world that emerged from antiquity was not reborn, it was reorganized. The collapse of classical order didn't erase knowledge, it scattered it like ash carried on trade winds. Empires had fallen, libraries burned, but their fragments survived in the hands of healers, scribes, and wanderers who refused to forget. Each fragment contained more than language. It held process, how to soak, to press, to distill, to draw the unseen essence from matter. These were the first laws of extraction, born not in laboratories, but in monasteries, temples, and back-alley workshops where medicine and magic were indistinguishable. The early Middle Ages were an age of quiet transference. From the ruins of Alexandria to the monasteries of Byzantium, scraps of Greek and Persian texts describing cannabis preparations moved in silence. They spoke of pressing seeds for oil, steeping flowers in wine, blending resins with honey or myrrh to preserve their potency. To most rulers, these were minor domestic crafts. To those who practiced them, they were survival manuals. When central authority fractured, knowledge decentralized, and with it came experimentation free from imperial oversight. A physician might no longer have access to marble tablets, but he had the plant, the fire, and the will to remember. In this diffuse landscape, the identity of cannabis began to stretch again. In the East, Tang-era scholars cataloged it as one of the harmonizing herbs, useful in balancing internal wind, a term that meant both physiology and temperament. Across the steppes, traveling mystics used its smoke as medium for divination, tracing shapes through rising vapor, as if language itself were suspended in air. And in the crumbling apothecaries of the Mediterranean, where plague and poverty redefined medicine, hemp oil became a universal salve, antiseptic, aromatic, and stable in storage when other balms spoiled. What had once been divided between ritual and science was merging through necessity. But rediscovery rarely appears as revelation. It arrives as repetition with awareness. Healers who could no longer read Greek reinvented its formulas by instinct. When they boiled resin in olive oil, they rediscovered lipid solubility. When they filtered tinctures through linen, they reinvented separation. The plant remained the silent instructor. Every failed experiment, every change in taste or color taught proportion. In time, that discipline became method, and method became doctrine. These small, forgotten laboratories, kitchens, shrines, and herb stalls were the birthplace of chemistry's consciousness. As trade routes revived under the Abbasid Caliphate, these crafts began to travel again, this time stitched into the commercial web that stretched from Al-Andalus to Samarkand. Caravans carried not only spices and glass, but manuscripts, copied, translated, annotated. The knowledge that Europe had buried beneath superstition was being refined in Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit, preserved in the libraries of Baghdad and the observatories of Bukhara. There, cannabis appeared not as relic, but as reagent, an active ingredient in the growing dialogue between matter and mind. The alchemists of this age sought purity, and in seeking it, they gave birth to process. This threshold between faith and experiment, between secrecy and record, marks the true rediscovery of the plant. It is here that the healer's intuition begins to transform into the chemist's reasoning. The story of cannabis enters a new vocabulary: extraction, distillation, refinement. Every empire that touched its leaf left behind a procedure, and every procedure became a cipher waiting to be read. From this point onward, its history would no longer belong solely to those who grew it, but to those who could interpret it. Before there were laboratories, there were hands stained with oil, ash, and the dust of ground leaves. The first alchemists were healers, not philosophers, and their work began not with symbols, but with patience. They learned that transformation didn't come from invoking the divine. It came from heat, time, and proportion. When they pressed the seeds of cannabis between stone plates, they found a clear, viscous oil that burned steady and clean. When they steeped the dried flowers in wine or vinegar, they watched the liquid take on color, scent, and character. These were not metaphors. They were the first controlled extractions, born from repetition and curiosity. Across early medieval Asia and North Africa, this empirical craft evolved into a discipline of substance. In Tang China, apothecaries documented ratios of hemp flower to wine, recording that longer steeping draws forth the warming essence. In the Abbasid world, Arab alchemists writing in Baghdad's House of Wisdom described tadbir, the art of preparation, detailing how temperature could open or close a material's nature. Cannabis appeared in these treatises not as a mystery, but as proof that matter could be persuaded. When mixed with sesame oil and heated over low flame, its resin dissolved, forming a solution that held its potency even when cooled. They had discovered what modern chemistry calls lipid solubility, the principle that fat binds and carries cannabinoids, transforming smoke into medicine. In the Mediterranean, Jewish and Byzantine physicians inherited the same logic. Galenic medicine had already framed the body as a system of temperaments, and extraction became a way to fine-tune dosage. A decoction boiled longer was stronger, a salve diluted with honey softened pain without intoxication. By the 10th century, the Kitab al-Saydala of al-Biruni cataloged these preparations in astonishing detail. Infusions, compresses, and perfumed oils derived from hemp, each classified by its effect: warming, soothing, clarifying. The healer's goal was never intoxication, but precision. To isolate the useful from the volatile was to imitate creation itself. What united these traditions was the concept of correspondence, that every transformation in the vessel mirrored one in the body. When resin darkened and thickened, it was said to age into wisdom. When a mixture separated, it warned of imbalance. The process became ritual, stirring clockwise to invoke vitality, counterclockwise to draw out impurities. To modern ears, this sounds like superstition, but beneath the symbolism lay methodical control of temperature and exposure. Their rituals encoded procedure, their faith disguised protocol. The philosopher's furnace was a controlled environment centuries before the word laboratory existed. Fermentation added another dimension. In India and the Middle East, healers began mixing cannabis with sweetened grain water or milk and leaving it to rest in sealed vessels. Yeast converted sugars into alcohol, which acted as solvent, dissolving resin more efficiently than oil or vinegar. The resulting tincture was filtered through cloth and stored in clay jars lined with wax to block light, the first form of shelf-stable medicine. Over time, these techniques spread westward, blending into the early apothecary culture of Europe. When monks in southern France brewed herbal tonics for pain and sleep, The recipes mirrored Sanskrit instructions written a millennium earlier. The language had changed. The process had not. By the late medieval period, these cumulative refinements formed a network of silent consensus. Every culture had discovered the same principles by different names, that heat released essence, that oil preserved it, and that patience determined strength. The art of extraction had evolved beyond necessity into philosophy, a proof that nature could be read if one learned her grammar. The healers who mastered it were no longer just caretakers. They were interpreters of transformation, translating chemistry into cure and faith into function. Their tools were simple: copper kettles, woven strainers, beeswax seals, but their implications were vast. For the first time, humans could separate a plant's spirit from its flesh, bottle it, and preserve it beyond the season of growth. The act was both scientific and spiritual. To distill was to understand permanence. From those first shimmering drops that condensed on a cooled lid, the lineage of all modern pharmacology began. The healer's alchemy was not about gold or immortality. It was about continuity, the human refusal to let knowledge die with a harvest. When process became pattern, record became scripture. The art of extraction, once whispered in workshops and herb stalls, began to move through the arteries of scholarship that stitched continents together. Knowledge itself had become a traded good, more enduring than spice or silk, and cannabis, humble, versatile, and adaptable, traveled with it, inked into manuscripts and marginal notes that crossed languages and empires. The chain of preservation that began with healers now passed to translators, philosophers, and physicians who saw in every preparation a reflection of cosmic order. The world was rebuilding itself through memory. In the 9th and 10th centuries, under the Abbasid Caliphate, Baghdad became the axis of intellectual gravity. Its libraries and laboratories collected fragments from Greece, Egypt, Persia, and India, works carried by traders, refugees, and scholars fleeing the chaos of collapsing empires. Within the Great Translation movement, cannabis was quietly standardized. The term cannab entered Arabic lexicons beside opium and henbane, recognized as a plant with both uplifting and clouding effects depending on preparation. Al-Kindi, the polymath of Kufa, noted that its oil serves to loosen the joints when applied with heat. These texts were less concerned with moral judgment than reproducibility. The early Islamic scientists Jabir ibn Hayyan al-Razi, Avicenna, turned recipe into method, measuring heat by the color of vapor, potency by the density of residue. What had once been intuition became formula. The translators who followed gave those formulas permanence. When Hunayn ibn Ishaq rendered Dioscorides de Materia Medica into Arabic, he cross-referenced cannabis with its Syriac and Persian synonyms, preserving its lineage through linguistic precision. Later, Gerard of Cremona and Constantine the African carried those same texts into Latin, bridging the Islamic and European worlds. Their manuscripts described tinctures, oils, and poultices made from cannabis, noting effects on digestion, inflammation, and sleep. By the 13th century, these Latin compilations formed the foundation of European apothecary schools. The plant that once grew untended on the edges of empire had become a standard entry in the catalog of learned medicine. Each translation was also transformation. The Greek humors were filtered through Arabic philosophy, reinterpreted through Persian cosmology, then reassembled under Christian scholasticism. In every shift, the language of healing adapted to the dominant theology without losing its empirical thread. To Avicenna, cannabis was a temperate, cooling herb that soothed the head when properly balanced with warming ingredients. To Albertus Magnus, it was a seed of moderation, potent yet obedient to craft. Their worldviews diverged, but their data aligned. Knowledge, not dogma, preserved the plant's reputation through centuries that otherwise punished deviation. By the time of the High Middle Ages, this intellectual relay had given birth to Europe's first regulated medical guilds. Apothecaries memorized dosage tables derived from Arabic texts, using color, viscosity, and scent as markers of quality. The The same extraction methods refined in the East now defined pharmacology in the West. Cannabis oil, often blended with rosemary or camphor, was prescribed for gout, muscle strain, and nervous exhaustion. The trade in these preparations spanned Venice, Cairo, and Constantinople, proof that commerce and scholarship were inseparable. Each depended on the precision of the other. The scholars' chain also forged the first scientific consensus. When healers from different faiths could replicate each other's results, the idea of universal truth took root. Cannabis, neutral and cooperative, became the silent proof that nature obeyed laws beyond Scripture. In its fibers and oils lay evidence that the divine and the physical were not opposites but expressions of the same continuity. The act of translation, therefore, was more than linguistic. It was philosophical. To copy an ancient recipe was to believe that knowledge belonged to no single civilization. When faith began to govern medicine, the body itself became a battleground for morality. What had once been studied for balance was now judged for virtue. The monasteries that preserved healing knowledge also inherited suspicion, a growing unease toward anything that could change perception or challenge divine hierarchy. In this new moral economy, the same plant that had carried empires through famine and war found itself on trial not for its failures, but for its power to open doors the Church could not control. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe's monasteries became laboratories of contradiction. In the herb gardens of Monte Cassino and Clairvaux, monks cultivated cannabis alongside sage, lavender, and rue. Their manuals recorded it as calming for the nerves and purifying of the spirit when taken in moderation. Yet, as theological doctrine tightened under scholastic influence, this same purifying smoke became suspect. Augustine's warnings about fleshly distraction were reinterpreted through the lens of sin, and by extension, intoxication became indulgence, heresy. Smoke, once prayer's companion, was now a rival language. Still, the memory of its sanctity persisted. In Ethiopia, Coptic monks burned hemp in censers during long fasts, believing its fragrance lifted the mind toward divine contemplation. In Sufi lodges from Persia to Morocco, mystics called the Fuqara used hashish as a means to dissolve ego and glimpse the unity of creation. For them, the intoxication of the herb was not escape, but return, the dissolution of the self into the eternal. Their poetry reflected it. Rumi's verses spoke of the wine of the leaf that humbles kings, a metaphor that danced between symbol and substance. The Orthodox clergy condemned these practices, yet they spread like song, carried by travelers who found in that smoke a freedom of spirit ungoverned by decree. In India, ascetics of the Shaivite orders continued rituals far older than Scripture. Their chillums burned with bhang and ash as offerings to Shiva, the destroyer, the transformer. Colonial observers centuries later would call them intoxicated. In their own understanding, they were meditating through combustion, letting breath become mantra and inhalation become communion. Where the West saw clouded reason, they saw dissolving boundaries. The moral divide between sin and sanctity was never chemical, it was cultural. Cannabis was not corrupting humanity. It was exposing the rigidity of the systems that claimed to define it. In the Christian world, this tension deepened as relic culture and miracle worship grew. Saints' bones and holy oils drew pilgrims seeking healing, while herbalists and midwives, often women, often poor, practiced the same acts under threat of persecution. A tincture of cannabis and myrrh could be medicine in a monastery, but witchcraft in a cottage. The distinction depended on who held authority, not what the bottle contained. Inquisition records from southern France describe seizures of green salves used for pain and blasphemous delight, their ingredients identical to the unguents found in monastic infirmaries. Fear became enforcement. Knowledge divided by gender, class, and creed created the illusion of righteousness through suppression. Meanwhile, outside Europe, the plant continued its pilgrimage unjudged. In West Africa, healers wove it into spiritual rites, honoring ancestors. In Egypt and the Maghreb, it threaded through music and ritual under the name kif, a word whose root means pleasure in peace. The contradictions of the Middle Ages between prayer and persecution, incense and smoke, revealed less about the plant than about human obsession with control. To inhale was to blur boundaries, to remind the faithful that divinity could dwell in sensation as much as in scripture. By the late medieval period, cannabis existed in two realities, as sacrament and as sin. In the East, it was a bridge between human and divine, a ritual tool of self-erasure. In the West, it was increasingly cast as temptation incarnate, the whisper of Eden's serpent, retold in vegetal form. The same smoke that sanctified saints in one world condemned heretics in another. Yet beneath the dogma a truth endured. Every civilization that touched the plant used it to seek connection. Whether in monastery, mosque, or temple, its essence remained unchanged, to soften the edges between worlds, to teach that understanding begins where certainty ends. By the dawn of empire, faith had given way to finance. What had once been sacred or feared was now measured in weight, yield, and revenue. The same plant that monks had cultivated in silence became a line item in the ledgers of colonial ambition: hemp for rope, oil for lamps, and resin for barter. Cannabis had always followed human movement. Now it followed conquest. The world's soil was being divided not by climate or culture, but by ownership, and every empire wanted its share of the green resource that made ships move and armies march. The story of Prohibition began not with morality, but with logistics. The expansion of naval power in the 15th and 16th centuries depended on hemp more than any other crop. The sails of the Portuguese caravels, the rigging of the British galleons, the ropes of the Dutch East India Company, all were spun from cannabis fiber. Each voyage that claimed a new coast also claimed new fields for cultivation. Russia became Europe's primary supplier of naval hemp, while England and Spain ceded colonies from the Caribbean to India to secure their own supply. The plant that once symbolized balance now powered dominion. Its global movement mirrored empire's reach, carried by the same winds that brought gold, slaves, and disease. Yet, even as hemp enriched the empire's machinery, its resinous twin, the psychoactive variant, began to trouble its conscience. Colonial officers stationed in India and North Africa reported the widespread use of bhang, ganja, and charas among laborers and soldiers. Some described tranquility, others defiance. The British East India Company, obsessed with control, could not distinguish between cultural custom and colonial risk. Their 1894 Indian Hemp Drugs Commission report, a document more scientific than moral, admitted that moderate use caused no evident harm, yet its very existence marked the shift from observation to surveillance. Cannabis was being studied not for its healing, but for its potential to disobey. This logic of control metastasized through trade. When profit became faith, every pleasure outside the marketplace became heresy. European merchants taxed hemp fiber as commodity, but criminalized its smoke as vice. In Egypt, French administrators under Napoleon outlawed hashish among soldiers after reports of laziness and reverie. In Jamaica, British overseers banned its use among indentured Indian workers, fearing unity and rebellion. The pattern repeated wherever colonial authority met indigenous tradition. What soothed the conquered became dangerous to the conqueror. Prohibition was not born of concern for health. It was born of fear that a shared plant could dissolve the illusion of hierarchy. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution transformed cannabis once again. Steam, steel, and synthetic fiber rendered hemp less profitable. Cotton monopolies and emerging petroleum industries saw in hemp a rival, renewable, versatile, and unpatentable. By the 19th century, propaganda against its intoxicating form conveniently aligned with economic interests that sought to erase it entirely. Newspaper barons, timber tycoons, and chemical manufacturers began to reshape its public image. In their rhetoric, the same plant that had built ships was rebranded as the root of decay, a narrative that would soon reach across oceans, packaged in moral outrage and printed in black ink. But the empire's hypocrisy was visible in its own markets. Apothecaries in London, Paris, and New York sold cannabis tinctures as pain remedies and sedatives. Doctors prescribed them to patients for migraines, spasms, and sleeplessness, all while governments condemned the same substance abroad as a threat to civilization. The double standard was not ignorance, it was structure. In the colonies, the plant was rebellion. In the metropole, it was revenue. Each law written against it preserved the illusion that control equaled morality. By the end of the 19th century, prohibition was no longer an act of faith or science, but an instrument of empire, a way to discipline the body and the mind alike. The rhetoric of salvation masked a new kind of slavery, the subjugation of consciousness to authority. Hemp became industry's past. Cannabis became its scapegoat. The language of virtue was rewritten in tariffs and taxes. Smoke, once prayer, had become proof of disobedience. And so, the age that discovered the globe also began to forget itself. In the race to dominate nature, humanity severed its oldest ecological contract, the exchange of trust between plant and person. What began as a collaboration of survival had become a hierarchy of control. The empire had learned how to conquer land, but not how to coexist with what grew upon it. The 19th century promised enlightenment, but delivered regulation. Science, newly armed with precision instruments and profit motives, turned its gaze inward to the chemistry of the human body and the plants that affected it. Laboratories replaced monasteries. Microscopes replaced ritual. The healer's art became the doctor's patent, and in that shift, cannabis, once understood through experience and reverence, was rewritten through measurement, abstraction, and fear. Industrialization had transformed medicine into commerce. Apothecaries evolved into pharmaceutical companies. Physicians became both prescribers and distributors. Cannabis tinctures, standardized by companies such as Park Davis and Eli Lilly, filled Western pharmacies by the 1850s. They were marketed as sedatives, analgesics, and antispasmodics, prescribed to soldiers, housewives, and children alike. But the very system that made cannabis accessible also began to dismantle its credibility. Standardization required classification, and classification demanded boundaries. The modern narcotic was not born from chemistry. It was born from paperwork. In an age obsessed with cataloging, everything required a label. Botanists separated hemp and cannabis into species, chemists isolated alkaloids and resins, and bureaucrats categorized substances by moral and economic value. Opium, morphine, cocaine, and cannabis shared one shelf, the shelf of euphoria, danger, and dependency. The new science of pharmacology spoke of stimulation and depression, of excitation and stupor, as if consciousness were a measurable quantity. In this taxonomy of sensation, cannabis, mild, unpredictable, and culturally diverse, became an anomaly that science sought to control. The plant's variability, once its strength, became its indictment. The industrial laboratory demanded purity, but cannabis resisted purification. Its resin contained not one active principle, but dozens, each varying by climate, harvest, and extraction. This complexity frustrated the emerging medical order. Cocaine and morphine could be crystallized, weighed, and dosed. Cannabis could not. What could not be quantified was deemed unreliable. The language shifted from herb to drug, from medicine to intoxicant. Within that semantic drift lay the foundation of prohibition. Cannabis did not change, its context did. At the same time, empire fed data into the engine of prejudice. Reports from colonial physicians in India and Egypt were filtered through imperial bias, classifying native use of cannabis as primitive and degenerative while ignoring its therapeutic applications. The very studies that praised its antiseptic and anti-convulsive properties also warned of moral weakness and native lethargy. The European gaze medicalized not to heal, but to justify hierarchy. Cannabis became a mirror onto which the West projected its anxieties about control, of labor, of race, of consciousness itself. In Europe and North America, industrial medicine merged with industrial fear. The American Medical Association, while still listing cannabis as a prescription extract, began lobbying for tighter oversight by the 1890s, citing variability and unreliability. In Britain, the Pharmacy Act placed cannabis among restricted substances. No new evidence had emerged, only new authority. The narrative of danger grew not from observation, but from repetition. Each regulation reinforced the illusion that control equaled safety, and that nature, left unregulated, was inherently suspect. Behind this policy theater, chemistry was making a discovery it could not admit. That isolation diminishes meaning. The search for the active ingredient fragmented the plant into its molecular parts, stripping it of the synergy that had defined its ancient use. Cannabinol was isolated in the 1890s, then misclassified as a sedative. Its weaker psychoactivity compared to whole resin-confused researchers who concluded that cannabis had lost potency. In truth, it was science that had reduced it, separating what nature designed to work in chorus. The laboratory could analyze the notes, but not the song. By the dawn of the 20th century, the language of the narcotic had fully replaced the language of balance. Intoxication became pathology, and pathology became policy. The healer's tools, heat, oil, patience, gave way to syringes and scales. Cannabis, which had once united agriculture, spirituality, and medicine, now stood accused in the court of industrial reason, too unprofitable to patent, too unpredictable to standardize, too ancient to fit the narrative of progress. It was branded obsolete before it was outlawed. Yet beneath this rising shadow, the plant continued to speak in laboratories and fields alike. Scientists noticed that tinctures eased muscle spasm in epileptic patients, that its smoke calmed soldiers haunted by war. But these whispers were buried under the clamor of invention. Industry had no patience for nuance. The new medicine sought precision, not understanding, conformity, not connection. Cannabis could not be made obedient, and so it was cast out. The invention of the narcotic was not a discovery. It was a declaration. It defined what kinds of relief were respectable and what kinds were criminal. It taught society to fear what could not be measured and to trust what could be monetized. Out of this redefinition emerged a modern mythology, that control equals knowledge, that sensation equals sin. And through that myth, the industrial world prepared itself for its next evolution, not of science, but of suppression. The 20th century did not invent fear of cannabis, it industrialized it. What began as a bureaucratic reclassification evolved into an ideological weapon, calibrated to preserve empire in a new form. As political colonies dissolved, pharmaceutical and legal colonies replaced them. The laboratory and the legislature became the new overseers of consciousness. Under the language of medicine, power learned to disguise itself as protection. At the heart of this transformation was the colonial pharmacy, a network of governments, corporations, and research institutions that converted cultural bias into medical dogma. In India, British administrators framed cannabis as a native vice, linking its use to disorder and poverty. Their own commission, the 1894 Indian Hemp Drugs Report, explicitly contradicted this claim, acknowledging moderate consumption as harmless. Yet, those conclusions were buried beneath imperial politics. Truth was not the goal. Containment was. The empire could not afford a substance that made laborers less compliant or soldiers more introspective. So, the plant that had built its ships and clothed its sails was now recast as the source of degeneration. The same pattern appeared across the Atlantic. In the Americas, the word hemp was replaced by marijuana, a linguistic sleight of hand that served to racialize the plant itself. The U.S. press began to associate its use with Mexican immigrants and black jazz musicians, embedding prejudice into pharmacology. Newspaper headlines warned of marijuana madness, painting images of violence and moral decay that bore no resemblance to clinical evidence. The psychological conditioning was deliberate, to equate a plant with an ethnicity, then an ethnicity with danger. Science provided the vocabulary, Racism supplied the rhythm. This was not ignorance. It was architecture. Colonial systems of medicine had always defined health as obedience to authority. In the early 20th century, that authority shifted from the church to the state, and from scripture to data. Public health became a tool for social order. To regulate bodies was to regulate populations. Laws such as the British Dangerous Drugs Act, 1920, and the American Marijuana Tax Act, 1937, were not responses to crisis, but instruments of cultural engineering. They criminalized not only use, but identity. A medicine in one community became contraband in another, determined solely by race, class, and geography. Behind the rhetoric of morality, industry found opportunity. The rise of synthetic pharmaceuticals promised precision, patent, and profit, everything that the living plant refused to provide. Companies like Bayer and Merck championed opiates and barbiturates as modern analgesics, promoting them through colonial medical schools and missionary hospitals. Their clinical literature dismissed traditional botanicals as unreliable native medicine. This campaign wasn't about efficacy, it was about ownership. A natural cure could not be monopolized, but its absence could. Fear became the marketing strategy of modernity. The racial dimension of this new order extended beyond borders. In South Africa, colonial administrators linked cannabis, called daga, to black resistance and banned its cultivation in 1911. In Egypt, French and British officials labeled hashish a threat to civilization, a phrase later echoed in League of Nations discussions that framed global prohibition policy. Western medicine had absorbed the logic of empire, to pathologize difference and legislate conformity. The science of health became the politics of hierarchy. Inside the laboratories, a quieter hypocrisy unfolded. Researchers continued to study cannabis for therapeutic potential, documenting its benefits for epilepsy, pain, and appetite, yet their findings were censored or reinterpreted to fit policy. Scientific journals published results under euphemisms like extractum cannabis indicae, separating the research from the rhetoric. The goal was to preserve knowledge without challenging authority, to maintain the illusion that fear was rational. Even language was policed. Words themselves became instruments of compliance. The colonial pharmacy thrived on that compliance. It taught the world that healing required permission, that knowledge required credential, and that freedom of consciousness was a disorder to be treated. The same governments that outlawed cannabis subsidized alcohol and tobacco industries, ensuring that dependence flowed through taxable veins. The contradiction was never hidden. It was normalized. Addiction was acceptable when profitable. Consciousness was criminal when free. By mid-century, this machinery of control had become self-sustaining. Universities produced data that justified enforcement. Enforcement produced funding that justified universities. Fear became an ecosystem. Every arrest, every confiscation, every moral panic reinforced the illusion of danger. The plant no longer needed to be demonized. The narrative did it automatically. A single leaf had become a symbol of disobedience to empire itself. And yet, even in the shadow of its own erasure, cannabis remained what it had always been, a mirror. It reflected back to civilization the truth it refused to see, that control disguised as care is still control, and that medicine divorced from empathy becomes weaponry. The colonial pharmacies built their empires on the pretense of healing, but in doing so, they turned wellness into hierarchy. The cost was not only cultural, but spiritual, a severed lineage of trust between human and plant, scientist and healer, truth and power. By the time the 1930s arrived, the machinery of fear no longer needed evidence. It had perfected spectacle. Policy became theater, and cinema became scripture. What colonial governments had begun through law, the modern state completed through story. Cannabis was not simply outlawed. It was dramatized. It ceased to be a plant and became a performance, a screen upon which America, and soon the world, projected its anxieties about race, class, and control. The transition from empire to entertainment was not accidental. In 1930, the United States created the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, appointing Harry Anslinger as its first commissioner. Anslinger understood what empires had known for centuries. Fear was most effective when sold as morality. But unlike the British or French, who framed prohibition as the burden of civilization, Anslinger turned it into a domestic crusade, a war for the soul of the family. His office fed newspapers with lurid tales of reefer-crazed youth, interracial jazz parties, and women corrupted by marijuana madness. None of it was true, but truth was never the point. The spectacle of danger was enough to command obedience. Media became the weapon that replaced the whip. Films like Reefer Madness, 1936, financed by moral reform groups, displayed exaggerated scenes of violence, insanity, and moral collapse. The cinematography mimicked the language of the pulpit, high-contrast lighting, shrill music, hysteria disguised as education. It was not journalism, it was sermon. Each screening reinforced the illusion that cannabis use led to madness, and that madness justified punishment. In reality, the drug most responsible for such violence was propaganda itself, an intoxicant of power that numbed the conscience while heightening control. Behind the camera, economics wrote the script. The timber magnate William Randolph Hearst saw hemp as a direct competitor to his paper mills. His newspapers spread stories of marijuana murder, blending racism and industrial lobbying into sensational headlines. DuPont's Chemical, seeking markets for synthetic fibers, promoted the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, ensuring hemp's demise as a competitor to nylon. Thus, policy was not the triumph of reason, but of branding. Narcotic became a trademarked fear, a word printed in bold type to justify both corporate profit and political dominance. Every headline was an advertisement for control. Psychiatry joined the chorus. Early psychologists, eager to legitimize their field, used cannabis as a model of induced insanity. In asylum records, patients, often immigrants or Black Americans, were diagnosed with cannabis psychosis, a term that collapsed environment, poverty, and trauma into one convenient cause. The laboratory of empire had become the laboratory of the mind. Madness itself was racialized, pathologized, and monetized. The state could now claim to protect public health while weaponizing diagnosis as deterrent. This manufactured hysteria shaped generations. Schools replaced botanical education with abstinence catechisms. Doctors were taught to fear their own tools. In one decade, cannabis was erased from pharmacopoeias and entered textbooks as a threat. The language of wellness was rewritten into the language of war. Users, addicts, delinquents. The vocabulary itself criminalized curiosity. What had once been called medicine was now called menace, and a single accusation, no matter how absurd, could end a career, a life, or a lineage of knowledge. Yet, even as propaganda triumphed, its fragility showed. Beneath the screaming headlines, quiet contradictions persisted. Scientific journals still published data showing cannabis as less harmful than alcohol or opiates. The same government that condemned it in public authorized pharmaceutical extraction in private. U.S. patent records from the 1940s describe cannabinoid-based sedatives developed under federal supervision. The irony was complete. The state had criminalized a plant while monetizing its chemistry. Madness was not a symptom, it was a system. Psychologically, the campaign worked because it exploited archetypes buried in the human mind. The foreign invader, the forbidden fruit, the loss of control. Anslinger's rhetoric painted cannabis as contagion, an invisible enemy infiltrating the home through music, migration, and youth. This narrative resonated with a nation reeling from depression and demographic change. By linking the plant to social instability, policymakers offered citizens a sense of moral clarity. The propaganda machine did not create fear, it organized it. What followed was an age of silence. For decades, generations grew up under the shadow of a story designed to erase memory. Farmers forgot the fields their ancestors had sown. Physicians forgot the tinctures once on their shelves. Fear had rewritten history so efficiently that even questioning it seemed radical. In classrooms, children learned that marijuana was an alien invasion, a chemical foreigner. The erasure was complete, and yet not permanent, because truth, like seed, survives burial. By mid-century, as the Cold War dawned, the machinery of propaganda would find a new purpose. What had been a moral panic would evolve into a tool of national identity. Fear turned into loyalty, control repackaged as patriotism. The story of madness would become the story of safety, and the war on people would masquerade as the war on drugs. The propaganda machine had done its job. It made obedience feel like virtue. When the smoke of propaganda settled, it left behind not silence, but laboratories. The mid-20th century dressed fear in a white coat and called it science. As the Second World War gave birth to the Cold War, cannabis was no longer framed as a moral threat. It became a matter of national security. The same governments that had outlawed it as madness began studying it in secret, not to understand its healing potential, but to weaponize its chemistry and control its narrative. The paranoia of empire had evolved into the paranoia of ideology. Research funding exploded under the banner of defense. In the 1950s and 1960s, U.S. intelligence agencies quietly commissioned studies to explore cannabis's effects on cognition, obedience, and interrogation. Projects like MK Ultra and Edgewood Arsenal tested psychoactive substances, including THC derivatives, on soldiers and civilians, often without consent. The goal was not medicine, but manipulation. Could the plant that once opened minds now be used to close them? Could it reveal secrets or erase them? In the Cold War's logic, consciousness itself was a battlefield. This new form of experimentation revealed the hypocrisy at the heart of modern pharmacology. Officially, cannabis remained a Schedule I substance, deemed to have no medical use. Unofficially, laboratories under federal contracts were isolating cannabinoids, mapping receptor pathways, and studying the very therapeutic properties that policy denied. Governments criminalized public curiosity while funding private discovery. The rhetoric of danger protected monopoly over knowledge. Control had become the highest form of intelligence. Pharmaceutical corporations followed suit. As patents became the new empire, companies sought to fragment nature into ownership. The plant's complexity, once a barrier, became a blueprint. Synthetic analogs like nabilone and dronabinol were created not to improve upon nature, but to bypass its legal definition. These laboratory replicas could be patented, prescribed, and taxed. The same molecule that could imprison a citizen could enrich a corporation. The line between medicine and control was drawn not in science, but in economics. Meanwhile, propaganda shifted tone from hysteria to paternalism. The message was no longer the weed of madness, but the drug of the uneducated. Anti-cannabis campaigns framed its users as dropouts and delinquents, a class divide disguised as moral concern. The counterculture of the 1960s gave the establishment its perfect foil: long hair, protest signs, and smoke. Every joint became a political act, and every arrest a performance of order. The government's war on cannabis was never about chemistry. It was about dissent. To criminalize the plant was to criminalize questioning. Globally, this divide hardened into policy through the United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, 1961, which codified prohibition under international law. The convention categorized cannabis alongside opiates and cocaine, despite objections from India, Pakistan, and other nations with centuries of traditional use. The vote was less about evidence than alignment, nations signaling loyalty in the Cold War's moral geometry. The empire of medicine had become a map of compliance. The laboratory and the flag now shared the same language: control disguised as care. Psychologically, the Cold War created a paradox that still defines modern pharmacology: the separation of healing from consciousness. Western medicine embraced sedatives, stimulants, and anesthetics. drugs that suppressed or heightened function, but rejected those that expanded perception. Cannabis, like psychedelics, defied the medical model of cure by containment. It encouraged reflection, empathy, and connection, all qualities that threatened institutions built on obedience. The plant was dangerous not because it harmed the body, but because it questioned authority. Inside the tension of this era, the divide between the sanctioned and the forbidden widened. Universities received grants to study synthetic cannabinoids, while grassroots researchers faced imprisonment for studying the real thing. Doctors were told to view cannabis users as patients in need of rehabilitation, not participants in an older medical tradition. Words like dependence and abuse replaced balance and adaptation. The healer's lexicon had been rewritten once again, this time by psychiatrists and bureaucrats in the same breath. Yet, even within this regime of control, truth persisted. Reports from within the National Institute of Mental Health in the late 1960s acknowledged that cannabis caused no physical dependency, no overdose deaths, and little measurable harm compared to legal substances. But such findings were politically inconvenient. They remained buried under the avalanche of anti-drug campaigns that fed the public a simpler story, that the plant was an enemy of the state, the family, and the future. In the Cold War's moral arithmetic, simplicity was the greatest weapon. Still, the more propaganda tried to silence curiosity, the louder the questions grew. Soldiers returning from Vietnam spoke of using cannabis not as escape, but as medicine, for trauma, for sleeplessness, for survival. Musicians and artists transformed that defiance into culture. The counterculture became an archive of resistance, preserving what governments tried to erase. Cannabis had survived crusades, empires, and laboratories. Now it survived ideology. The Cold War did not just divide nations, it divided the human relationship with truth. The same system that weaponized the mind sought to patent the cure for its own anxiety. Science, stripped of humility, became propaganda with better grammar. But beneath the noise of politics and patents, the plant waited. Its chemistry did not change. Our willingness to listen did. And in the next era, the so-called war on drugs, that silence would be broken not by scientists, but by citizens. By the dawn of the 1970s, the war on cannabis was no longer metaphor. It was doctrine. What began as propaganda had hardened into policy, enforced not by science, but by surveillance. The plant had become a proxy for rebellion, and rebellion itself was criminalized. In the United States, President Richard Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one. But the real enemy was political dissent. The war on drugs was a war on consciousness, and cannabis, humble, ancient, and stubbornly democratic, was its symbol. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 codified that symbol into law. Cannabis was placed in Schedule I, alongside heroin, labeled as having no accepted medical use. It was a deliberate lie, written in the language of science but rooted in politics. Internal memos from Nixon's administration, later revealed, admitted the strategy outright, criminalized the culture that opposed the war and civil rights movements. John Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's top aides, confessed decades later, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." Law became camouflage for social engineering. Enforcement expanded like an infection. The newly formed Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, militarized domestic policing, flooding neighborhoods with raids and informants. Courts redefined possession as intent, turning casual use into a felony. Incarceration rates climbed exponentially, disproportionately targeting Black and Latino communities. Families were fractured, futures erased, and an entire generation grew up believing that the pursuit of relief, reflection, or creativity could end in a prison cell. The war on drugs was never fought in laboratories. It was fought in living rooms, classrooms, and the streets of the poor. Media once again served as the amplifier. Television spots depicted glazed eyes, melting brains, and broken families, equating the joint with ruin. Each commercial promised salvation through fear. The Just Say No campaign of the 1980s distilled decades of propaganda into a slogan simple enough to silence doubt. Yet even as fear blanketed the airwaves, culture refused to conform. Music, art, and film became conduits of defiance. Reggae, hip-hop, and rock each turned the leaf into language. Bob Marley's lyrics echoed through radios and protests alike, turning what the state called contraband into communion. In defiance of criminalization, the plant became a creed, a quiet rebellion grounded in rhythm and roots. The irony deepened as the very agencies that criminalized cannabis simultaneously funded studies confirming its medical potential. In 1974, researchers at the Medical College of Virginia, under DEA contract, discovered that cannabinoids inhibited the growth of certain cancer cells in mice. The study was buried, its funding cut. When rediscovered decades later, it became emblematic of the era's hypocrisy, knowledge suppressed in the name of control. The truth was not hidden because it was uncertain, but because it was inconvenient. By the Reagan years, the war had globalized. The United States exported its prohibitionist policies through trade agreements and foreign aid, pressuring nations to adopt identical bans or risk sanctions. The rhetoric of morality disguised a new colonialism, not of land, but of law. Countries from Mexico to Thailand, Jamaica to Ghana, were forced to criminalize their own cultural traditions under the illusion of modernization. Cannabis became contraband in lands that had once considered it sacred. The war on plants was, in truth, a war on memory. Psychologically, this era revealed the full depth of control. Fear had evolved into habit, a reflex embedded into generations of public schooling, policing, and politics. But beneath the surface, resistance germinated. The counterculture of the 1960s had not died. It had gone underground. Veterans of the anti-war movement began advocating for medical use, armed with data and defiance. Farmers and patients cultivated in secret, passing seeds and strains like heirlooms of freedom. The underground press exposed contradictions in enforcement, while comedians and musicians mocked the absurdity of state paranoia. Humor became the language of survival. This was not merely protest, it was re-education. Each arrest inspired questions, each conviction inspired documentation. Scientists in Israel, led by Raphael Mechoulam, isolated delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, in 1964, mapping the plant's psychoactive mechanism with rigor that Western governments had abandoned. Their work revealed what the propaganda machine refused to admit, that cannabis interacted with a biological system already present in every mammal, the endocannabinoid system. Humanity was not foreign to the plant. It was designed to receive it. The revelation reframed the narrative entirely. Cannabis was not invader, but mirror. The war was never on drugs. It was on recognition. By the close of the 20th century, the consequences of this war were impossible to ignore. Prisons overflowed. Communities were devastated. Billions had been spent policing what could have been studied. Yet the plant persisted, growing in fields, basements, and memories. It survived prohibition by doing what it had always done, adapting, waiting, teaching. Even under the harshest laws, it found cracks in concrete, sunlight through steel bars. The same resilience that carried it through ice ages and empires now carried it through bureaucracy. And as the century turned, the world began to awaken. Patients suffering from cancer, epilepsy, and chronic pain defied the law to find relief. Doctors risked licenses to tell the truth. States began voting not for intoxication, but for autonomy. The war on plants, once declared unwinnable by its own architects, was entering its final act. Yet its scars would remain. The lost years, the stolen lives, the generations taught to fear their own biology. Still, the lesson endured that prohibition cannot kill what is symbiotic. The plant and the people were bound by evolution, and evolution does not yield to legislation. The war on cannabis had always been a war on the idea that nature could be enough. But truth, like the plant itself, has a habit of breaking through. The roots remember. For nearly a century, fear was treated as fact. A plant that had once built empires and healed civilizations became the enemy of progress, its story rewritten by power until truth itself seemed narcotic. But even in silence, the soil remembered. Every banned seed still carried the memory of light, every criminalized hand the memory of care. What the world called rebellion was simply nature refusing to forget itself. The 20th century mistook control for safety. It promised order through prohibition, purity through punishment, and medicine through monopoly. But none of it healed the wound between human and plant. Beneath the machinery of propaganda and the bureaucracy of fear, people kept finding the same quiet miracle that healing had always been within reach, buried only by permission. The act of growing became a kind of prayer, whispered through cracked basements and hidden gardens, a defiance that was never loud enough to start a riot, but too stubborn to die. Science, too, began to drift back toward memory. In laboratories once built for suppression, the data began to speak louder than ideology. Researchers from Israel to Canada, from the Netherlands to Japan, rediscovered what their ancestors had already known, that the cannabis plant was not a chemical accident, but a biological conversation. The endocannabinoid system, mapped molecule by molecule, proved that our bodies were designed to mirror the plant's chemistry. The myth of separation collapsed. Evolution had written cooperation into our cells, and no law could erase that signature. But knowledge alone would not end the war. Culture would. The same artists, patients, and teachers who were once called criminals became the architects of reform. They began to tell a different story, one rooted in community rather than compliance, stewardship rather than profit. From the underground presses of the 1970s to the medical ballot initiatives of the 1990s, the language of cannabis changed again. No longer a narcotic or rebellion, it became testimony, proof that humanity's oldest medicine had outlasted its own erasure. And yet, the victory was not total. For every state that re-legalized, another tightened control. For every headline about progress, another warned of chaos. The same economic forces that once banned the plant now sought to own it. Corporations rebranded prohibition into profit, replacing moral panic with corporate polish. The green rush was born, and with it came a new kind of blindness, one that spoke the language of freedom while quietly commodifying it. The question was no longer whether cannabis would return, but who would be allowed to claim its rebirth. That is where Part 3 begins, at the threshold between redemption and repetition. The modern era tells itself it has evolved, but evolution without reflection is just a loop. The laws are changing, the markets are swelling, and the plant is speaking again, louder this time, through data, art, and science. The challenge now is not discovery, but remembering what discovery means. To rebuild trust without repeating conquest. To let the roots grow without trimming them for convenience. Because cannabis was never just about intoxication or industry. It was, and still is, about relationship between soil and spirit, body and memory, truth and the courage to face it. The next chapter isn't a return to innocence, it's the confrontation with what we've done in its absence. The age of fear has ended, but the age of responsibility has just begun. This content is for educational and informational purposes only. It does not promote, encourage, or depict the consumption, sale, or cultivation of cannabis where prohibited by law. All discussion is presented through verified historical, cultural, and scientific context, in alignment with U.S. federal and state educational guidelines for documentary media. Always follow your local, state, and tribal regulations, and consume responsibly where legal to do so. All narration, writing, and sound design are original. No third-party music or licensed materials are used.